Recitatif by Toni Morrison, along with some considerations for Raymond Carver's Cathedral. Two different short stories we're addressing here this second to last week. Toni Morrison is still alive in her 80s, born Chloe Wolford. The Toni comes from the confirmation name Anthony she chose after converting to Catholicism at age 12, and the Morrison is her married name. Considered one of the greatest living American authors. She has received the Nobel Prize for Literature as well as a Pulitzer Prize for her novel Beloved. And if you're familiar with any of Morrison's works, say from previous schooling, chances are it is with this novel Beloved or another novel called Song of Solomon. Influences upon her work: African American oral and literary folk traditions, Latin American literary magical realism. Magical realism, if you remember, was described when we discussed Cheever's The Swimmer. Early 20th century American modernist literature, especially Virginia Woolf and William Faulkner, the guy who wrote A Rose for Emily that we've already covered. Morrison's fiction is experimental because of her seamless blending of the above influences, as well as an overall narrative technique which calls into question the assumptions of fiction and readership, specifically along the lines of gender and race, because of course she is an African American woman. Recitatif is her only published short story, and the title is a musical term, referring to a passage of narrative or dialogue in an opera sung in the rhythm of ordinary speech, as opposed to the sustained pitch-modulated notes that are more stereotypically associated with opera. Now in the story, just to give you a sense of what's going on here, because that can be confusing because of her very experimental form, Roberta and Twyla, two young girls, meet as 8-year-olds at St. Bonnie's Children's Shelter and Orphanage. Then again as young adults at the Howard Johnson's Rest Stop Diner. Then 12 years later after they're both married. Then during the fall's racial strife and picketing, the school integration over busing. Then later when Twyla's son Joseph is in college outside of a hotel party. Postmodernism and postcolonialism in Morrison's fiction. These two tend to go hand in hand. Most obvious awareness and conspicuousness of these were during the 1950s and after. Postmodernism, in particular, is considered modernism with a sense of humor, a very self-reflexive sense of humor. Self-aware, self-conscious, self-reflexive literature, highly metatextual and metafictional. You may or may not have heard these terms before. Metafiction, metatextuality. What that means is fiction that breaks through the fourth wall. I'm sure you've heard of that term before. It's when a work of fiction demonstrates an awareness from within that it is a work of fiction. The simplest example being when a character starts talking to you as the reader, when of course in a pure world of fiction, characters are not supposed to be aware that they are works of fiction. Highly deconstructive because of its stylistic playfulness and the presence of the absurd and the outrageous. Imitative and ironic, borrowing from a lot of previous literary conventions and genres, hence lots of parody and pastiche. And in particular, here's the post-colonial aspect of it. Morrison is using this to question, undermine, and invert Anglo, white, hetero, straight, and fallow, male, normative conventions, mores, definitions, and expectations from a non-Anglo, that is non-dominant culture, viewpoint and experience. Again, her particular experience is as an African American woman. Considerations for recitatif. The racial ambiguity game that Morrison plays throughout the story, it becomes very clear that she's having some fun with you as a reader. It's a game of racial ambiguity based on expectations which are founded upon racial stereotypes. Let's see if you can figure that out. It shouldn't be too hard. And the problem of the past, especially remembering the past. And also some considerations for the other short story, Raymond Carver's Cathedral. Consider the awkwardness of the situation that sets up the story. The whole springboard for the story is an awkward situation. See if you can define that awkward situation. What makes up the narrator's insecurities and his wife's instabilities? They are a very flawed couple, as we shall see. The gritty, beat presence of alcohol and drug use in the story, and the unexpected quasi-religious element that the story begins to assume. Its title is, after all, Cathedral. And the deeper meaning of the it mentioned in the story's final line, which certainly has something to do with the quasi-religious element. I look forward to your responses.